Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White, and today we have the extra special pleasure of a new series that we have launched, that Will, Linn, and I have launched with Dr. Dennis Slattery. This is just more special than you can possibly imagine. And as a way of opening this up, as you know, we have been producing, Will, Linn, and I have been producing the Myth Salon for about 4 years. And it suddenly ramped up during the time of the coronavirus, where we're doing Myth Salons every other week now. And we've had interest in other faculty members like Lionel Corbett we're doing talks with, and now Dennis is coming on board to do these. At the end, we'll tell you a little bit more about our plans for a continued session with Dennis. As part of what came about, I was introduced via email by Connie Zweig to Clyde Ford, who, famous book, Hero with African Face. So I have been trading emails with Clyde because he's going to come and join us for our Myth Salon. Title of his new book is called Think Black. And it's so relevant to what we're experiencing in our country today. So I thought I would read you a little poem. I have always thought in color, dreamt in waves of blue skies, rolling green landscapes, rainbows, and shapes of puffy white clouds forming themselves into animals. But then I realized that textures, dirt and grime and grit, they don't penetrate my mind's world until I allow the outside in, until touch and contact become real, and I learn to feel pain, pressure, and love, until I become wounded. Love is the fingerprint of your edge and mine making contact. The definitions and separations blending into one another. I imagine ways for one thing to become another, for change and transformation to pen the script of my soul's narrative, for me to try you on for size and to walk a mile in your shoes, to trespass the boundaries of my psyche, to learn the language of your vulnerability, so together we can construct trust. I seek ways to combine all the colors, to trash the ideas of purity, whiteness, and singularity. I want the colors to combine, yet preserve their hue, their uniqueness, as if the one in everything can express the all in one. A community is like a great chain of being, where shared essences course through the veins of the body, an organism with a heart beating, that we are all implicated in one another like shards of the soul's code, as necessary to one another as the sands are to the shoreline. So I'd like to do a real gratitude to Clyde Ford for his book, his works. I encourage you to look on Amazon for the full breadth of what he has written. He's a great man. And so with a little bit at the welcome, I would like to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Will Linn. Let him say a few words, then each of us will go around. And then we'll sit back and bask in the wisdom of Dennis Slattery. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, I'd just like to, what we're gonna do is each of us is gonna introduce why we are here, John, Dara, Kwame, and Dennis, and why we want to commit our time to doing this series of conversations with Dennis. And for me, there are really four reasons. And the first reason is, well, actually, I'm going to come back to the first reason. I want to respond to what Dana just said about Sangha, about community, because that's really one of the primary reasons why I'm doing this, for community, for the community of the 6 people on this screen, and for the community of all the people that are joining us now. That's one of the main reasons I'm doing it. Is it just feels good to be with a community, and I think it's one of the 3 necessary things to progress with a spiritual life for a reason. So the second reason why I'm doing this is plain and simply Dennis. It's just Dennis, because really going back to his classes at Pacifica, it was sitting in Dennis's classroom that made it so that made me, like, you know, when you feel like you've drank too much coffee, but you can't move and you can't talk, but you're sitting there and you just have this, like, what do I do with this energy? Move to California. I got to move to California. And I moved to California. And I think, honestly, it was the excitement I had in every one of Dennis's classes that confirmed that conviction that I needed to get out here. And it's the energy that he stimulates, and it stimulated in me that is one of the probably the biggest reason why I wanted to do this, and want to support Dennis doing this. The third reason is conceptually, just I think that our world benefits from more mythology and more mythopoesis. I think our world benefits from a more poetic relationship with nature, with the world, a more symbolic way of seeing things and reading things. And I think that Dennis is a true teacher in leading us into that relationship, more mythopoetic relationship with the world. And the fourth and final reason that I'll mention about why I'm so excited to be doing this is that, look, COVID is a crazy thing. We're in crazy times. I don't know where things are going, but if this is our World War II moment, I don't know. If it is, then one thing you look at in history is that the artists lead the academics. I'm very moved by what happened in 1949 when you have Hero with a Thousand Faces, Myth of the Eternal Return, and Lord of the Rings, these 3 great systemic breakthroughs in mythology. But I'm especially interested in the 1937 to 1939 Hobbit and Disney and Marvel and DC, because something happened with the artists first before World War II, and something happened with the systemic thought after. And so right now it feels like it's the time for the artists. It's a time to feed artists. It's a time to feed the creative soul, because we don't know where it's going to go yet. We don't know what to say intellectually totally about this, but we do know that we should be feeding the creative soul. And I think that that's what this program is first and foremost designed to do, is cultivate creative relationship with the self, for creatives and for individuals. And I just feel like that's a very valuable and important thing to do, period, right now. And with that, I'm gonna hand this torch off to the next one of us to introduce why he or she is doing this, and hopefully say just a little bit about Dennis to continue the introduction to him. John, do you mind jumping in next, please?
Well, it's good to be here with all of you. As a storyteller and a writer, I find myself very much during this period unsure of so many things. And I think if we've learned anything from mythology or from the ancients, when you are unsure, maybe the most sure thing you can do is to go and be with your tribe. And tonight, that's why I'm here. I'm here to be with my tribe. I'm here to be with others that experience the world through art and who see the world through artistic lenses. I'm here because I'm reminded of the idea that Thomas Merton offered us, that art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. And I'm hoping that I can find a bit more of myself. I'm hoping that through the words of others, I can see myself more clearly. And I don't know about you, but I've really been wrestling with identity issues during these moments. And I think hearing someone like Dennis tonight and being able to dialogue with him about these ideas will bring a healing for many of us. And that really gets me to my final point of why I'm here, and that is because if you tell me that Dennis Slattery is going to be talking about myth anywhere, I will be there. And I have been deeply impacted by the way that Dennis has taught me to look at my own art. I believe just as much that as bad art can be actually damaging to a culture, that good art can be healing and transcendent to a culture. And we need more voices like Dennis who can lead us into good art, better art, and to help us appreciate and promote the type of art that our world needs right now. It's an honor to be here tonight. I would like to pass the microphone over to my dear friend, Kwame. Kwame, why are you here?
Thanks, John. I'm here primarily because of Dennis. Because of Dennis, just like Will said, wow, Dennis, just sitting in your classes, man. Epic imagination, and then I pulled out one of my papers from Mythopoetic Images today, and read that. So I'm here because of Dennis, primarily, and also myth. When I first started studying myth, I saw the importance of mentoring, and I just found that the mentee he would just sit and listen for the most part. And using the quotes with the youth, we say water picks up the sediments of the channel which it travels. So I'm here because of you all too, okay? So when Dana showed me the names, I'm just like, wow, cool. So water picks up the sediments of the channel which it travels. Sufi saying, he who travels without a guide needs 200 years for a 2 days journey. And my favorite one, you make your friends your teachers, and you mingle the friendly art of conversation with the advantages of instruction. So I'm just here pretty much to learn. So today, this is new for me. I'm pretty much just going to be a student. So I will speak when spoken to, but outside of that, I would prefer to just go along for the ride. Okay, so wow. Glad to be here. Glad to, really cool seeing you guys' faces. All right.
Hello, everyone. And I have to join the chorus of people who are here because we are so privileged to have Dennis lead us again. I remember every time I was in Dennis's class, I would arrive that day not knowing where I would go, but very sure it was going to be a great trip, great journey. And I'm sure I will not be disappointed today. I was really thrilled when I heard from Dana and Will that they were setting this up, and I was very honored they asked me to join the panel. I hope, as most of you know, I work as a story analyst, and one of the things that I have observed in my work throughout the years is, or at least I'll tell you, this is my prejudice, my bias towards this, is that in the same way that the psyche communicates through our dreams, I really believe our culture communicates through our stories. And if our psyche is hurting, we seek help. We have therapists, we have friends, we have counselors, wise men and women who can help us through it. But when our culture is hurting, and it is speaking through its stories, my question is, who's listening? Who's paying attention? And I believe that our background and our training at Pacifica has really given us, and not just Pacifica, because I think there among the participants, I think many of you are here because you didn't specifically go to Pacifica, but you have studied yourself and you have a deep interest in this. And we have training and we have an understanding and a background of how to keep our ear to the ground, how to see these archetypal images as they spontaneously arise, and to greet them. And Will, in the same way that you brought up all of the narratives and the storytelling that were in some way so prophetic at other crisis points in our times, I really think we need to be paying attention to our stories, and not just the beautiful, well-organized stories, but we've been having apocalyptic fiction and zombie fiction and all kinds of things for a long time now. And I think there's a very clear voice speaking through a lot of this material that we have to get past the sort of the literary judgment and be listening more deeply, because there is information about fear and horror and feeling lost and feeling disconnected. And if we can collectively, you know, really open ourselves to our stories and hear them, we can also find collective ways to respond. And I think that's just really important and critical right now. So like Kwame, I'll speak when I'm spoken to, but I am just thrilled to be able to, well, sit back and just enjoy where we're headed. And by the way, I just want to add one little note. I'm so thrilled you're bringing Clyde Ford on. I've had the privilege to teach with him, and not only is he a wonderful writer, he is the most amazing speaker and teacher, and you will just absolutely love his work and love what he is doing. So I encourage you to buy his book and join in the work ahead, because it's going to be wonderful. So, and now to Dennis.
Wow, I'm overwhelmed by your comments, your love, your authenticity. It's really quite moving, and I can't thank you enough, all of you, and all of you participants out there who have joined for today. I'm just very excited to present. You know, I hope for several meetings, and as I mentioned to Will this afternoon, I've done a lot of writing and publishing, but there is so much that I've written and published that I've never had an audience for, where I could present and then receive some responses on how it's working, what it's bringing up for you. So it's like a new medium for me. And so I'm just very grateful. And to Dana and Will for orchestrating this and setting it up. And I just want to underscore too the context in which we're all here. An explosive pandemic that is getting legs under it that couldn't even be foreseen. And I live in Texas, about 45 miles north of San Antonio and about 50 miles south of Austin. And so we're in the thick of it. And I count my blessings that 2 weeks ago today, I had gallbladder surgery, and the hospital occupancy was modest. Today, they're all but filled. And so it was a bit of a rough time, but nothing like today in the state of Texas if one has to be hospitalized for whatever reason. So I just want to acknowledge all who have died and all who have been infected, and that we keep them in our prayers and in our thoughts. I want to begin with an image, and I'm going to hold it up. So this is an ammonite pulled out of a desert close to Morocco, and it's estimated that it's 7 million years old. And it's one of the most beautiful spirals. I'm trying to get the light not to hit it so that you can see it. Here's the backside of it, kind of crude, kind of coarse. But then when it's sliced open, it creates this majestic aesthetic image of the spiral. And I don't know why, but I began using this when I would offer writing personal myth retreats, and I would hand it to the person to my left, and he or she would hold it, and I asked them, just look at it for 15 seconds. Introduce yourself. maybe make a comment of how you've been occupying your life, and maybe one thing that you're thinking about wanting to get out of this, usually 3 days, 3.5 day writing retreat. So hundreds and hundreds of participants have handled this. And while you can't, I just ask you to imagine, if we had the time, for this to be passed to you, and you identify yourself to the group. It wasn't until several years after I began using it that I came across in the dream seminars, 1928 to 1930, in which Jung is with two colleagues, and they're working one dream after another. And the dreams are short, 2 to 4 sentences. Well, I'll never forget, on page 100, left side of the page, Jung is riffing off of a dream that has been presented. And he makes an allusion to nature. And then he says the following, and I have it pretty much memorized. He says, all psychic development is spiralic. We are always folding back, but we can't land on where we once were, but we can land a little bit above it or a little bit below it. And as Thomas Wolfe told us many years ago, you can't go home again. But Slattery has a codicil of that. True enough, but you can get back into the neighborhood so that you're not back at home, but you're in the neighborhood. I love that. It struck me so powerfully that Jung gave psychic development a geometry, and it's the spiral, not the circle. So I just share that with you to give this a little bit of a history and a little bit of a context. And for my own thinking, I think the creative act of learning is spiralic, where we go back and we retrieve something, we pull something forward, maybe in a new context, and then we push it forward. And as Dara was saying a moment ago, and then we see where it goes. And we don't know. And that's part of the wonder, as John has spoken when he spoke at the Myth Salon so beautifully about curiosity and wonder. So I am excited to present, and I'm going to get going here. But I really, I work best in an interactive environment, in the classroom, in conversation. So I want to present for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to pause and check in with you all, both the panel and the participants. And I don't know how much material I have here, but knowing that I'm Irish Catholic compulsive, I know that I probably have 2 to 3 times what we can get to, but that makes me comfortable to have excess. And so let's see how far we go, and if we care to pick up the remainder of it in a second class. So there's 2 parts that I have for you. One is on the goddess Hestia, because I'd like to give what I'm going to say a mythic inflection through this wonderful goddess who I fell in love with through an article by a student who was a year behind me at the University of Dallas in the early 70s, Barbara Kirksey. And I bet many of you know the volume by James Hillman called Facing the Gods, which he edited. And I think there's 7 essays on a different god or goddess. And I was reading it just randomly a couple of years ago, actually. And I came on Barbara Kirksey's essay on Hestia, and it just opened up something in me, and I knew I had to write about it. So I'm going to start with that. And then I'm not sure if we'll get all the way through it. I may pause before it. I'll watch the clock. And then I'd like to shift to Dante's La Vita Nuova, in which he has a vision that determines the trajectory of the rest of his life. And both of these are in the service of a topic that Will suggested. It's been a couple of weeks now. He says, I'm really interested, and especially given the school that he teaches at and directs, between myth and art. And is it seamless? Is there a gap? And so I want to use a couple of the sonnets, of the 41 sonnets that comprise La Vita Nuova, to have us explore what Beatrice at some point entered our life as a vision that gave our lives the trajectory that it's been on ever since. So the analogies that Dante provokes, I think are really worth considering vis-a-vis the personal myth that each of us is living in. Okay, so that's the frame. So let me get started. I was going to go to the Riting myth book to offer a few comments about personal myth, but I decided I have plenty here. And if we have the sustaining power to do several of these classes with all of you participating, I want to do at least half of a session on my book, Writing Myth, Mythic Writing, and delineate further, not only the spiral, but some characteristics of personal myth that I've come to, and a few that I've read that I incorporated into that book. So I want to begin with a mythic image, and we're at about 7:30. So I'm gonna keep my eye out for around 8 o'clock, or perhaps a few minutes after. So I want to begin with this mythic image, a mythic figure that I hope will ground my observations at the same time that it sets up conversation. I came across Hestia in an article that I mentioned Barbara Kirksey had written. So I thought it pertinent to ask, what god or goddess gathers us around the heart's way of knowing? Now this way of heart knowing is finally what led Dante to write the Divine Comedy, but through the vessel of the Vita Nuova. So this heart knowing, what Dante calls intelletto de amore, the heart's intelligence, the love's intelligence. I'm fascinated with the feeling of that, and linking the heart to gnosis, to a way of knowing, if not a way of being. So Barbara's fine essay on Hestia, A Background of Psychological Focusing, is the subtitle. I think it helps us see some outlines of this goddess that is central to the hearth of this class. We learn that Hestia is the oldest of Kronos and Rhea's children, and the youngest, since she was the first to be swallowed and the last to return from Kronos' stomach. Does this, and this is a question that I pose to me, you may want to entertain it when we take a pause. Does this endow her with a sense of all time, of the first and the last, the alpha and the omega of a life, of a feeling or an idea? Something inclusive, I sense, attends her position in the stomach of time itself. Is she the divine presence that surrounds a gut feeling of struggling to stomach what is unpleasant or irritable, when we might be tempted to throw up our hands, our stomach, our tolerance, our patience, and to allow us to stomach what is so unfamiliar as to make us wish to throw it out, hurl it as far as we can, or to deny it and simply dispense with it. When we feel we are about to lose heart, does she, Hestia, stifle such a moment to allow us to entertain it further? And I'll say something in a moment about Hestia and her ability to entertain. And if you don't mind, I'm going to pause once in a while to take a sip of hot tea. Little is known about her, but for the purposes of this presentation, let's move to how she fits into heart work. She was worshipped at the center of the city. She dwelled at the heart of the polis, and by occupying that position, she gave it an order that it would not have without her. Ordinary principle is at the heart of art and of myth. An ordering principle. This is what happens to me when I take a typed manuscript and then write cursively into it. Then I understand my students' rightful complaint. Well, I'm glad about the grade, but I can't read your writing. Can you fill me in here? And then we pause, and I usually make something up because I can't read it either. So she's an ordering principle at the heart of art and myth. I've got Will's mandate here to try to work this space between. Hestia was presented often as a heap of live coals, the omphalos, or the navel at Delphi, the center of the world. So centering seems to be a inflected virtue that Hestia carries. Her Roman counterpart, you know, is Vesta. And in Rome, where we lived for 2 years, 1976 through 1978, one of our favorite monuments in the city, very close to the heart of the city, was the temple to Vesta, this elegant, modest, round circle in which is carried the city's hearth fire. And in Roman mythology, it was believed that Rome would survive until and unless that fire in the temple of Vesta was extinguished. And that would signal the end of Rome. So she's important, and she carries the circle, the geometry of the circle. Now, on an affective level, when I read of Hestia, something happens inside. I begin to dream of the hearth place, red, glowing, welcoming. For me, Hestia is heartfeltness. She inspires such a disposition. And I'm also thinking, even as I'm speaking microcosmically about one goddess, I'm asking myself too, is this part of the Greeks' wisdom that they understood that all of these qualities and impulses are in the soul of each of us? And what they did, and not quite simply, I was going to say simply, but it's not simply, they gave each of these some outer image by which to contemplate them. So I ask you to think about, what is it that the goddess or divinities offer us that maybe we can't get to without them? They give us the via or the road in, maybe a corridor in. Heart knowing is a disposition to knowing as well as a content of something known. So myths, for me, I'm going to extrapolate a little bit too as I move through this. The power of myths doesn't reside simply in the content of the myth, but the context in which the myth is asked to be read, entertained, interpreted. So both content and context, for me, mythically, are equally as valid and necessary. I say this to set us up for Dante's experience of Beatrice as a Hestian moment. And I'll say more about that, but I want to try to make some linkages even early on here. So while there are two pieces, I think I'll feel better if I'm linking them some way, not uniting them, but at least making some connective tissue. In Hestia's presence, one warms to one's subject matter, one situation, to another person. Whatever is presenting itself, she warms relationships. She warms them up. She doesn't heat them up. She's not fire. She's the low glowing coals. When we feel we are warming to a person or to an idea, to an event or a situation, Hestia is present as an impulse, but even more importantly, as an attitude. So I'm thinking these days about these mythic figures as attitudes towards experience, if not attitudes towards ourselves. With her presence, something begins to be heartfelt and will be recollected in that same way. Something lying bitter in the memory can sweeten over time with the presence of Hestia's presence in remembering. She can transform the way something is recollected and is gathered again into consciousness. I also believe she is central to the acts of reading and writing, especially in those moments when we sense a deepening and realize we are reading or writing from a place other than conscious cognition. Something else enters, some other way of evoking ideas, new insights, and feelings in these processes. Hestian moments where in the heart is allowed in. Feelings themselves ripen into insights. I want to read that again. Feelings themselves in Hestia's presence can ripen into insights. In writing these words, I tried to give myself completely over to the presence of this marvelous feminine figure in the Greek pantheon. Hestia's prevalent image is not of a person, but of a situation. Now you can go online and type in Hestia and you'll get 1,000 images. I find all of them unsatisfactory. I don't think she's a figure in the way that other gods and goddesses are figures. She's a presence. The heart and the fire are contained in this image of her, or in this situation that she fosters. I think it's both the hearth fire as well as the heart's fire. We learned from Barbara's essay, and now I'm quoting from her. Hestia is the domestic fire and makes feasts possible. End of quote. One who has an open hearth, a welcoming hearth, also has an open, welcoming heart. a warmth that people wish to gather around and to be heated by. As such a divine presence, she condenses hearth and soul. Barbara also reveals to us that Hestia's value in psychological life is her ability to mediate soul by giving a place to congregate, a gathering point, not unlike this, not unlike the situation that we're all engaged in right now. And I loved your comments at the beginning because you all called up Hestia in your own way, in your own vocabulary. She may be the Greek patron saint of conferences, workshops, retreats, even the classroom, when it is functioning as it should. This is my sense, as a place of ideas freely moving and uniting around a central text or a central idea, the heart of the day's matter. In any of these venues, she congeals soul and place and welcomes so to entertain ideas, various and contradictory points of view, let them in. Energetic exchanges, dissent, but always with an underlying structure of hospitality, uniting people and ideas by and not in spite of their differences. As goddess of hospitality, she is ever present in Homer's Odyssey, where hospitality towards the stranger is bedrock to the continuation of civilization. That guest-host relationship has to be hospitable to the stranger. Divisiveness, hostility toward the other as stranger, domination of the other are clear signals of Hestia's absence. I'll say more of this in just a couple of moments. I have for years, often in a very unconscious way, been rising at 4 a.m., perhaps for the past 26 years. When I enter my study in the deep darkness of outside, I create a space for what might happen this particular morning. I light a candle. I often light a stick of incense. Then I settle into journal writing and ask simply, what wants to be remembered from the day before? And then I sit quietly. And then something inevitably pops up, and then I start. As I read in the morning, I beg your pardon, for instance, and something suddenly calls to me to underline it or to pause over it, to write something in my tablet or to pen a few words in the margin to return to later, Hestia is guiding me. She brings the virginal into secular space. What is sacred, unpolluted, carrying with it a profound purity, a cleansing, and maybe most important of all, a sharpening of focus. Her flame's presence creates a dwelling. She allows my imagination to dwell in a particular, unique way, which, I must admit, begins to fade at the first daylight. The graying of the sky outside my study window. Then some transition takes place inevitably. As Hestia was the first and last out of her father Kronos' stomach, so is focusing the point of both beginning and ending. And that's Barbara Kirksey's notion. As beginning and ending, Hestia helps us to break out of linear thought exclusively, and she opens us to circularity, the realm of mythos. I would offer here that one investment of myth is that it is a way or a via that promotes focusing. What allows me to focus on anything is the myth I'm in and perceiving by means of. What I focus on is mythos. To bring an image into focus situates it at a place where it produces itself repeatedly. Writing and reading are two forms of focusing, or focusing in on something that has attracted our attention. There exists as well a heat or a fire to focusing, a focusing fire. When an image I am trying to bring into focus, perhaps it's a way of trying to bring an image home to the illumination of the hearth, comes more into itself in a sharpened focus. The lens is to move, not the image. Hestia is the lens, I think, of sharp focusing, of clearing all debris from the image so that it can speak on its own terms, allowing it to become hospitable, to invite hospitality. I would suggest to you that an image out of focus with blurry edges and a fuzzy halo about it is an unhestian image, an image that has not yet enjoyed the hospitality of Hestia. Not through argument or logos, but more through guesting the image, does Hestian warmth begin to affect the image, to invite it into greater focus. The image is now open to expose its own heart, its heat, and even more importantly, its possibilities. What are possible in the image? When that question comes to us, I think Hestia is sitting next to us. The German word herd, H-E-R-D, is the word for hearth, which is the same etymologically as to focus. Barbara gives us that beautiful connective tissue in her essay. So an image's focus is its center, its hearth place, where the greatest energy of a storm gathers, even a volcanic eruption. Quote, finding a place for is a Hestian activity. When an image finds its right place, then it is fully a guest that can enlighten us and illuminate us. We know the image from its deepest interior outward. Reading, writing, speaking some idea or image into being is Hestian behavior because, and I've just got a few bullet points that I'd like to share with you. Reading is a way of finding the hearth of a thought. It aids in focusing. It aids in amplifying and allows words, imperfection, even diseases in. It lets images help me focus rather than I focus on the image or the idea for one perspective only. Reading then is a lens allowing or inviting focal adjustment. Hospitality is big hearthedness. So when I read, and I think this is true of writing as well, but I'm thinking about reading. When I read, I journey. I journey towards and hope to find the hearth. I do both at once. This is from a lengthier version of this Hestian article that I decided I really want to include. Now, there might be a little bit of overlap, a little bit of redundancy, but just forgive that. Within her presence, within her pristine position, Hestia is able to guard images. Hestia illuminates. Her illuminating provides protection and fostering of the image. That's Barbara Kirksey. Perhaps the early Greeks felt there was some sacred, even divine quality to the image, so they assigned a goddess to hold it. In an imaginal way, Hestia amplifies the image, seeing by means of her illuminating prowess into the image's possibilities. Learning takes place precisely in this instant of amplification as well as protection. On this note, perhaps we can venture that Hestia is very close and instrumental to the origin of myth itself. If you'll entertain that myth is akin to a via, an avenue or corridor that promotes focusing. So I want you to entertain the notion that one of the virtues of myth is they help promote focusing. Not fixation, but focusing. A myth can also include a particular style of understanding. I've thought recently about myth and style. Are myths styles of being aware, styles of focusing? And I pose it as questions because I'm entertaining that, but I'm not sure. What allows me to focus on anything is the myth that I'm in and perceiving by. I said there'd be some redundancy. My personal myth is like my home. From it, I look out through very unique windows and doors onto the world. It's the home base of my illumination, where I am lit up by an idea, like the light bulb over the cartoon character's head. That light bulb carries the wattage of Hestian illumination. It carries the energy of the eureka moment. That is such a delight when it occurs because it transports us to another home base from which to understand something new or to understand something old in a novel way. Barbara further illuminates the rich complexity of Hestia by relating an insight by the Roman poet Ovid. And that is that the word focus and hearth is so named from the flames and because it fosters all things. Ovid. To continue the idea of myth stated above, what allows me to focus on anything is the myth that I'm in and perceiving by means of. Myth may be understood then as a focal plane and a focal point. It is where energy gathers to make something meaningfully and often originally present. Hestia is a goddess of presencing, of bringing into view, of crossing and pausing in my field of vision. Any of us can experience moments in our lives where our trajectory, our purpose, and pursuits are all out of focus. Art, poetry, therapy, writing, painting, conversation are opportunities for regaining our focus, which is to say, our purpose. Absent any tincture of Hestia, a life can become out of control, unfocused, without direction, and empty. We are not home any place under any circumstances. And so we wander in the world orphaned. That's an un-Hestian life. Self-image then may at times appear and feel distorted, indistinct, or simply in opposition to our earlier image of ourselves. Sharpening our focus is a form of remythologizing our lives, infusing it with clear purpose and vision. And that is starting to point at La Vida Nuova. Barbara believes that, quote, returning to an image again and again from various directions is an attempt to focus. It's an attempt to find the fire of the image, maybe the fire in the image. This is imagining in a Hestian mode, she writes. When we repeat a thought, an action, an attitude, it has a chance to grab hold with ongoing energy. Hestia then is also part of repetition, of pattern constructing and pattern maintaining. Writing, rewriting, revising are Hestian behaviors. For in the rewriting, one's focus sharpens. Fire, light, illumination clarify. They show boundaries and borders. They make a crisp image, rich and subtle. A certain clarity promotes nuanced and subtle seeing. Hestia helps us nuance the things of the world. She may be the source of nuancing itself. So she helps us nuance the things of the world we focus on and find important, even indispensable. I would add that, like writing and rewriting, reading and rereading are also Hestian. Repetition to sharpen and deepen our understanding invites Hestia into such a place. When we reread, for instance, we see details, connections, and associations that the first reading skidded over and just missed. Rereading, I have found, is never just a doing again. It is a movement into the unfamiliar because we are now familiar through the first reading of what is present. Now we can focus on what was not there in that virginal reading. Barbara reveals at the end of her rich essay how Hestia joins two elements of human understanding back together that have suffered separation for millennia. And those are imagination and perception. Together, they help to foster what she calls a central virtue of Hestia, and I've already mentioned it, hospitality. As the guest-host relationship is so central to the action of Homer's Odyssey, as I mentioned, as Odysseus struggles to regain the hearth in his home with the assistance of his son and wife, Penelope, so does Hestia offer a rich and welcoming ground for ideas and images to be entertained. Being hospitable to ideas and opinions goes much further than being in opposition or at war with those that question or disagree with one's own. In making this connection with Homer's epic, I would venture that there may be present in the Hestian hearth presence, the element of restraint, of pausing, and of holding back in order for what needs to be present itself in its fullness to become apparent. It's a form of patience, or of dwelling with rather than mastery over. Patience and restraint of allowing time to host an idea, allowing time itself to host an idea or an image or another person, seem to be Hestian attributes. The slow glow of the hearth fire is an apt metaphor for Hestian speed. It dwells rather than races. It inhabits instead of darting here to there. And it settles rather than scoots aimlessly. So hosting ideas allows them the safe space to be voiced and heard. It's one of the reasons I keep coming back to the myth salons, because that's allowed. That's not only allowed for, it's encouraged. So to guesting ideas is the voice of the visitor, the newcomer, the one seeking to feel at home with his or her thoughts and opinions. Conversation, so absent in today's cultural sites, witnesses the presence of Hestian space and a word that we don't hear too often anymore, courtesy. A word whose etymology returns us to the heart. Courteous acts like listening and then speaking without attacking or colonizing the other's understanding evoke the presence of Hestia. In authentic conversation, we adjust to the other's thought, insights, speech, or writing, and they in turn adjust to ours. Not agreement necessarily, but perhaps a certain consensus is the offspring of Hestian conversation. Not agreement, but consensus. I think they're different in some important ways. Hospitality then is an opulent form of big-heartedness. I think it takes a large heart or great-souledness to listen with real attention to another without violating that space with one's overriding opinion or response. Warming to the other's ideas is not synonymous with surrendering to them or to pretend one agrees. Rather, it is to allow the fire of their own perspective to infiltrate and perhaps modulate our own stance. Allowing such is a grandly hospitable endeavor that allows one to dwell with a contrary point of view in apposition, not opposition. In his lead article on the necessity of abnormal psychology, Ananke and Athena, James Hillman posits this bold and provocative insight. Here's what James writes. What the gods show in an imaginal realm of myth is reflected in our imagination as fantasy. Let me read it again. What the gods show in an imaginal realm of myth is reflected in our imagination as fantasy. End of quote. Hestia is an archetype of the imaginal realm, who bestows on our own imagination a civility, a courtesy, and a continuity because of her gifts of focusing, hospitality, and hearthpitality. I hope you'll allow that neologism. It's clumsy, but I still like it. Hearthpitality. Without her, learning and human relationships would be flat, self-absorbed, static, and most likely in continual strife. In closing, I think it is Hestia's dynamism, with her central image of the hearth fire, that most animates my interest in her. She is less a goddess of acquiescence than she is of acceptance. Less of yielding, more of a yearning. Less hellfire, more hearth fire. when we notice that more of what surrounds us and dwells within us is placeless and homeless, even orphaned, in thought, purpose, insight, or voice, we may be drawn to light a candle to Hestia to invite her in. She comes, I believe, by invitation only. When she shows up, be prepared to be a proper host so she can guest herself into our souls, there to kindle a fire that might have gone out without our even being aware of it. Her presence will her presence will spark gratitude in any who care to notice her. Yeah. So let me stop there and thank you for your attention to some of those musings. And now I'd like to open up a space for any of you, for all of you, for any reflection, any observation, where Hestia stepped in front of you and said, look here.
Dennis, I'm really struck by everything that you said during this. And the thing that occurs to me in talking about Hestia is that her forms of expression are more about being rather than doing. So she seems to be a condition rather than an activity. A lot of the gods that we have studied at Pacifica and everywhere else are context driven, and they're action gods. They're gods that are on the move. And what you're bringing up is the center of, if we listen to our heart, if we listen to that quiet sense, the silence, the warmth that beats inside all of us, we can silence that loquacious voice that seems to be taking over much of our narrative. And I think that what you did was you've started this off in a place of listening, and I really commend you for it, and I thank you for it. And with that, I want to say less and hear more. I noticed that John has unmuted himself, and maybe you would jump in there.
Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, Dennis, one of the 1,000 treasures that you laid before us here in the last 30 minutes that really struck me was this connection between myth and focus. And as you talked about the idea of rewriting as focus and rereading as focus, I think I'd always thought of those two processes as being a very linear process of getting from point A to point B. I get from unfocused to focused. However, as I heard you talking about it, it occurred to me in much of my work, where we're dealing with cameras, when you find the focus on an image, it's because you go in and out of focus in order to finally find that image. It's not a linear process. You're going back and forth between out of focus and in focus. And it was comforting to me to hear you say that's part of the process, in rewriting and in rereading. I just wonder, could you speak to that just a bit more? Because my heart was exploding in my chest as you were talking about that. I just wonder if you could just elaborate on that just a bit more.
Well, I love the lens, and I love the circularity of Hestian space. So, I mean, your example is a beautiful illustration of that turning. And, even as I'm doing this and seeing myself in the mirror of the screen doing this, this is already starting to implicate the spiral. You know, it's that turning back and forth. So the reality blurs, then it, what did Leonardo, I just finished the Walter Isaacson's magnificent biography, 600 pages of Leonardo last night. And Isaacson is so beautiful in reading many of Leonardo's paintings. But Leonardo perfected the sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O, the blurring of the boundary, the shadow, so that shadow and places that are shadowy and places that are light blend into each other. There's no line between them. And I'm thinking of that sfumato method that Leonardo perfected as part of the lens of blurring and then sharpening, blurring and then sharpening. And John, for me, that's what conversation, good conversation where people are listening to each other and riffing off of maybe what somebody said, you know, your ear picks up that blurring. And well, it's not just quite clear yet to me. And yeah, so it's all of a piece, but this is all, as Dana so well said, Hestia is a presence, is a presencing. You know, she's the attitude of presencing, if I could say it that way. So anyhow, that's where I am, John, with your wonderful camera image. Yeah.
You know, as we were diving, thank you, Dennis. That was so, took me back. so glad to be listening again.
Thank you, Dara.
You know, when we talk about the subject of mythopoesis, I think we have to be aware that it's not a thing. it's not an act you consciously do. It's the idea that just in the same way individuals individuate and grow, so the culture grows as well. And so the stories we tell are going to reflect our transformation. And I posed at the beginning how our stories are how the culture shares its pain, shares its hurt, shares its identity, and so on and so forth. And something in all of that really struck me in what you said, because this idea of re-listening, that the stories are there. In other words, who we are as a culture, where we are, is self-evident. If you have the capacity to read it and see it for what it is. And as I posed the question, you know, who is doing that? And I think a lot of us are stuck on the first read. And so we are very limited in our view because our first read tends to be through the filter of our own bias. And so we only hear what we hear, you know, and we don't have much of a capacity to see what the heart wants to tell us. And in particular, it just made me jump over and think about when Kaepernick took a knee, and how the story that got associated with it didn't want to acknowledge what it was. It was limited to its own view of what that was. And the story of Black Lives Matter and the stories, we have to re-listen, because in not having the capacity to see through what is going on and what it's telling us about who we are and where we are going, we're not moving with the flow of energy. I mean, and that's what transformation is. transformation takes consciousness, and it takes effort applied over time to transform. And you know, we have to understand that you know, I think we're living in a time where the story is transforming so fast. Not only do people have to, you know, catch on to what's going on the progressive realm, but also on the progressive realm, we need to hear the story of those who haven't caught up, because we're all not listening. We all are putting the filter and not getting to the re-listening and the re-understanding of the stories we're telling ourselves, because those stories can lead to a much healthier environment if we have the capacity to see into that wound.
Yes.
And help it heal.
The image that came up as I listened to you, Dara, we wore them in Cleveland, right by Lake Erie, the frozen, bitter winters, these big mufflers on our heads, sometimes with a wool cap maybe, and then the mufflers, or earplugs. That's what ideologies do. They stop us from being able to hear anything that is not ideologically inflected towards what our ears are accustomed to. So, yes. And so I mean, I don't want to go to how, but breaking through.
Can I comment on that? The only comment I will make is that I remember once I was in therapy and I was very frustrated because I don't remember even what the issue was, but I was frustrated that I didn't feel I was being heard. I remember, this was great advice. My therapist said to me, she says, just keep saying it over and over as unemotionally as you can, and you will be heard. You know, it will be heard. And I think that's really great advice. We can't give up on the narrative. We can't give up on the story. We can't. I also wrote down as you were talking, using the whole image of Hestia minding the fire, because if we are persistent, the idea will catch fire. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing that right now with the Black Lives Movement.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and I think
example.
We have to be persistent. We have to be persistent to hear the story and to tell the story.
And to tell the story. Very nice. Yes. Yeah, beautifully said. Yep.
Well, I just wanted to jump in on that portion about the system and the way that the systems can get like mufflers, where you stop listening to things outside of the system. So, you know, if you want the system to be ordered, you want it to be as cold as possible. Because when it's cold as possible, every piece in the system, if you get to the Bose-Einstein condensate, when things are so cold that the electron can't even stay separate from the proton, boom, right? It's so cold that the system becomes so ordered, right? So, but when the system is so ordered, there's no individuality left inside the system. So there's something interesting about if the system can be seen as the home, as the macrocosm, as the space, and the individual as in that space, then a frozen system has no lateral freedom for the individual. And a warmed system is a system where things can move around. We're not in a solid state.
Yeah. It's a great analogy, Will. Great analogy.
If I can keep building off that, part of where that comes from is I'm listening to you. What I'm thinking about a lot is the relation where Hestia seems to in some ways represent the relationship between the macro and the micro, where the big picture pops into an insight and you see the system and an idea, where, you know, the world becomes the world navel, where the hospitality of the space to the individual, right? The big feelings become the focused insights. The home becomes the focused hearth. The Rome is represented by the fire, and the heart knowing may actually even be something like that. The knowing that is the relationship of the micro to the macro, the knowing of the macro through the micro to know the macro, or something like this. The polis and the hearth. And so anyway, I just wondered if that sounded resonant to you, that Hestia kind of maybe represents the dynamic relationships of the whole with the individual, and the individual with the whole, the world with the micro, and the macro with the micro.
I think that's the big-heartedness of Hestia, that there's space for all of that. And there isn't a selecting process. And one always has to ask who's doing that selecting, as Dara was implicating just a couple of minutes ago. But I think that's the beauty of her generosity as a presence and as an attitude, that if the space stays loose enough and elastic enough that other possibilities see, oh, there's some space for me in this. I think that's when learning, is one of the times when authentic learning really takes place. And it's that open-heartedness to other possibilities. And as I mentioned, not that you then yield to it, because you may feel, well, I don't buy it, but I want to hear you articulate it. Well, there's hope there. Yeah, there's hope there.
I'm gonna jump in.
Yes, please, Kwame.
Thanks, Dennis. A few things resonated, especially the listening piece, and then Dara, you're talking about the own biases with the youth. As many of you know, we get them in 6th grade, keep them till they graduate from high school, all through myths and fairy tales, but a lot of quotes. Dara, you're talking about the own biases. A few of the quotes we use, they say, only an open mind can contain the secrets of the universe. They say a child who never leaves home believes his mom is the best cook. With the youth, the one thing that's so impressive is just the intensity of their listening, okay? Because basically we tell them, generally speaking, life is about, it's about making decisions. It's about making decisions, and generally speaking, the more information you have, the better decision you'll make. So it's so interesting in the myths, when we'll ask the youth, if they have to make a decision, I don't really care what their decision is, but what I'm more focused on is why they're making the decision. And then for them to listen to the other youth and listen to their rationale. And one of the most rewarding things is to hear one of the youth change their mind based on listening to somebody else. So yes, I mean, it's just the importance of listening is just so.
Yeah.
Another thing, Dennis, that you were saying that resonated was the importance of the relationship between the guest and the host. And you said you were going to kind of touch on it later, Hestia's absence, because in America right now, Hestia ain't present. Okay. No. Hestia ain't present right now.
No.
Okay. So,
no.
Thanks, brother. Thanks, man.
Yes, thank you for that, Kwame. Anybody else out there? Should I push on into Dante at this stage?
No, I am gathering a whole helping of questions from the audience.
All right, then let me pause. Let me
try and relay a few of those to you.
Okay.
So let's see, a couple of these in front of me here.
Yeah.
Well, how about
go ahead.
How about addressing Voris wrote a Q&A in the Q&A rather than the chat box, but
Thank you.
I was able to go over there and say, oh, somebody else is talking over here. How do you relate this to the dark feminine and how that relates to what we're going on with today? Because there seems to be a real absence of, I won't necessarily say it's all the dark feminine, but we have a chthonic absence today about deep feeling that is just not coming through in the culture. Seems to be a lack of hope. There's like, we don't know where the end in sight. We're stuck in this prolonged liminality where we don't know what the end is or where it's going to come or how it's going to appear. And we need some guidance. And that guidance has to come from the deep sense of what it is to be soulful and to be human, because that's what we're seeking. And where would you put Hestia in that? I mean, she seems to be kicked out of the house.
Yes. Well, you touch on a couple of the qualities absent, and maybe this is a synonym for one that you mentioned, but a woeful absence of depth and a superabundance of distractions. And that's not accidental. I remember, and it's been, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years now, the fierce and ferocious attacks on liberal arts learning and on the humanities. Now listen to one radio show in which a man castigated and chastised the parents of a child who was majoring in art history.
Mm.
And he found that blasphemous and insulting. And he said, how economically is your child going to support him or herself? I can't remember if it was a young man or woman, studying such nonsense. And I was just flabbergasted. I think I missed that transition. But there have been a number of governors of states in the United States who have cut any funding for humanities education. And of course, they're always after PBS and NEH, National Endowment. I don't think one can have a consuming culture and a reflective culture. That there's a choice that seems to be pushed that has to be made. I don't quite believe it, because I think there is a balance of both consuming and contemplating. I don't think they necessarily cancel each other out. I know that I'm not addressing the dark feminine. I'm not sure. And I wish I knew more that Voris is posing. And I'd love to hear from Voris and his thoughts on that. But this absence of depth and a addiction to being entertained and being passive, I think, are just addictive vices that are creating what Nicholas Carr calls the shallows. You know, I don't know if you know that book. He's brilliant on the way technology is affecting our brains. And he begins the book with a conversation of 2 Yale buddies from years past who made enormous fortunes in the .com industry. And they admitted to him that they were incapable of reading a novel anymore, because they said, our world has been in bytes and bits, and to read a novel is to retain what has happened, to understand what is happening and maybe see what is going to happen. They said we're incapable of doing that anymore. They said our brains have been rewired to the point that we can't even concentrate on something for more than a couple of minutes. And I just found his book apocalyptic in his insights. So I think, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial here, but it's being engineered. Yeah, it's being engineered to cancel out the ability to reflect on something and to discern something in it outside of one's own ideologies.
So I've got something to add to that, Dennis.
Please.
Some of you may know that Lewis wrote a book called The Screw Tape Letters, and it is subtitled How to Corrupt a Christian Soul. So it's all about how to corrupt people, right? Yes. And one of the greatest insights in there was keep people in the stream. And this is before there was streaming. By this he meant newspapers, right? But the point is, as long as you're consuming information, you're not reflecting on it.
That's right.
So keep people in the stream so that we're constantly stimulated will keep us from ever reflecting.
Yes.
Which, by the way, also keeps us more likely to maintain or sustain the perspectives presented by the stream than whatever we might generate through reflection.
Yes. Yeah, it's the elimination of the pause. It's the elimination of the pause so that there's no dead air time. And by that I mean a time to reflect on what one has been taking in. Yeah.
On that exact note, let me say, on pause and on slowing down and taking time. We talked this earlier this afternoon. We were talking about, well, how long do we want these to go? An hour and a half and 2. And we said, well, things just start to get good about an hour and a half in. That's when, and so I'm going to suggest that we stick with this topic, continue to let it breathe and open and have warmth and space, and try, instead of trying to squeeze in a second one, if that sounds right to you.
I'm fine. As you and I spoke, and I think the spirit of this insists on it, we're all in an experiment here. So let's see how it goes. Let's see if this much is too much, not enough. So I want to stay very loose and flexible. And quite honestly, I'm very interested in some of the participants. And I thank all of you, first of all, but also some of the participants. I'd love to hear your riff on any part of this and extending it.
To the participants, I'm going to call you out on this one thing. You got to watch out for the master teachers, because sometimes they're working on 2 or 3 layers ahead of us. I know that the medium in the message, right? So what you've done, for those, some of us have noticed, you've just informed the medium with your message. By presenting on Hestia, you've informed our approach to what we're doing. How brilliant, Mr. Miyagi. So anyway, I do think that that's wonderful, because talking about Hestia has helped us create space, not just for how we as a panel will relate, how these sessions will be engaged, but
Yes.
also you've also backdoored in how the imagination relates to itself and how we relate to the imagination by talking about Hestia. So thank you, and
Yes.
is opening up to the audience. I just wanted to acknowledge it.
Thank you for that, Will. Yes.
I would
And
also,
yes, please.
I would also say, Dennis, that we have a group of people, all of whom are bright, educated, have insights, but we've kept them out. And by putting a group of us in here, I think what we can do, if we can do it successfully, is have people raise their hands. They can come in as a voice, which is like a window.
Yeah.
It doesn't turn it into one of those Zoom sessions where you have 40 postage stamps sitting up there and you can't see who people are.
Yeah.
But we'll have to figure out a way to orchestrate this, and I have control over that so that I can bring a panelist box up. There was one repeating question that has come up, and Dennis, I'm going to put this one to bed. There's very few problems that I can solve in life, but this is one of them. Would you spell Barbara's last name?
Kirksey. Sey. Kirksey. Yeah.
Kirksey.
Kirksey.
Great. You know, we have just slayed quite a few dragons with that. You brought her up, and is that an essay that maybe I could get from you?
Yes, it's in Facing the Gods.
Okay, it's in Facing the Gods.
The edited volume of James Hillman. It's a beautiful volume. I didn't pull it off my shelf, but I think there are 7 essays. Artemis, Athena, Hestia, I think Dionysus. Anyhow, it's just a gem that James Hillman, of course, invited these different people to submit. And I remember Barbara, she was a year behind me. I started in 1972 on the doctorate at University of Dallas. She came in 73, and she was a brilliant student, and I got to be good friends with her. And so when I saw her name in the essay, in the collection, I thought, well, I'm going to see how Barbara's been thinking about myth and archetypes, and what a treat. So she was my foundation for what I presented to all of you this evening, and I tried to give her credit at every point that I was pulling from her work. Yeah, she's
Great.
and I've tried to contact her, not any luck, and I don't know if she's done any other publishing, to be quite honest, except for the dissertation. Yeah.
I will locate her work and maybe make a copy of it and make it available.
It'd be beautiful. Yes.
Our first guest from the gallery is Edward. So if you have a question for Dr. Slattery or any of us, go for it.
Yeah.
Dennis, this is Ed Smink. Thanks.
Oh, Ed, I recognize your voice. Glad you're
Yes.
here.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in how Hestia is an attitude of the soul. And what came to mind for me was the classical understanding of discernment. So using the word focus, I'm wondering if you could also entertain to discern what the soul is asking of you, and also both personally and both individually. And it's a classical understanding of Ignatius of Loyola with the concept of discerning the spirit. What is the right spirit to act out of? So that's my question. Also, how you tied in hospitality, and not only the sense of the host with the guest, but also the understanding of what happens between the host and the guest, and then also what happens interiorly because of that action. That's a new understanding I learned in the research I did for my book that you helped me articulate. Thanks very much.
Yes. So Ed is the author of The Soul of the, Ed, help me, The Soul of the Caregiver, or The Soul of Caregiving. Oh, maybe he can't hear me now. Yeah, so I chaired his dissertation, and his life has been spent as a caregiver professionally. Geez, he tossed a number of things out there. Let me pick it up where I intuitively feel I ought to move to. I spent 4.5 years writing this book, From War to Wonder, Recovering Your Personal Myth Through Homer's Odyssey. And it was published the last week of December of 2019. And its structure is on the order of Day-to-Day Dante and Our Daily Breach. 1 page per day for 365 days. So maybe 8 to 9 lines from the Odyssey per page. What I noticed in doing that was something I hadn't noticed in teaching it over many, many years. And that is the way that Homer understands the fluid nature of the guest and the host. So that in conversation, you may host a guest's speaking, and then the roles are reversed and the guest becomes the hosting of your speaking. So it's fluid, it's reciprocal, it's hospitable, and it leaves space for the voices of the two. And of course, it could be more. The piece on discernment enters the Odyssey through the figure primarily of Athena. And she says to Telemachus in book 2, she appears as Mentes, and is completely ignored because the suitors, obsessed with their own appetites, have no understanding of hospitality. In fact, they would see a stranger coming in as, oh, this is another mouth to feed, and that's going to be less food for us in that kind of stingy, acquisitive, super consumer mentality. But Telemachus, who has been taught the laws of hospitality, approaches him because she's disguised as a man and brings her into the house and finds a place for her to sit. And she has one question for him. Are you open and willing to be taught? If you're not, I'm out of here. If you are, I will tutor you. And at that moment, he becomes a student. And Ed, this is a movement of his soul. Now, it's so fascinating to watch this act of hospitality be rewarded by this goddess. He doesn't know that she's a goddess, but she begins to school him. And up to that point, he's been a whining 20-year-old. And woe is me, and my mother and I are victims. Once Athena brushes against Telemachus' soul, in the next scene, he steps in front of the 108 suitors. I mean, this is a gang who do nothing but party and consume all day, and then they go back to their houses. And these are the young men of the Aristoi of Ithaca. These are the well-heeled. When Telemachus opens his mouth, he speaks with such authority that the suitors stop eating and look up at him. And Homer describes, and then they put their upper teeth against their lower lip. Now they know they have an adversary because he speaks with the voice of authority. It's just a marvelous moment in learning where he is hospitable to the wisdom of this stranger, and in exchange begins to not reclaim, he begins to claim his own voice and his own authority. And now he speaks as a host in the household and not a whining guest. So Ed, I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope that some of that touches on discernment. See, what he learns with his voice of authority is to discern. And these suitors know in their hearts that this is somebody that is courageous and eloquent and persuasive in his speaking. That's the power of Athena's discerning capacity. Yeah, and it's just one of the most eloquent moments in the entirety of the 24 books that comprise the Odyssey. Yeah. So others maybe. Yeah. Yeah, because I have almost 10 tills, so of course we're not going to touch Dante tonight, but please, any others?
Hello.
This is Sheila.
Hi,
Yeah.
Sheila.
Hi, Dennis. You know that I'm coming from a birth psychology place, and
Yes.
a little bit more somatic than Jungians are used to, probably. But Francis Mott wrote Mythology of Prenatal Life, and in it he's got a picture of a drawing of a severed umbilical cord. There are two veins and one artery, and in that cord, through which nutrition passes, it forms a spiral. the place that it implants is a circle. So I think it's a way of considering that perhaps we are getting these ideas for our myths prenatally because we're embodying them. I'd like to know your opinion on that.
No, that's wonderful. One of my dissertation students years ago put me onto a book entitled Body Eloquence.
Oh, yes, I have the book.
Do you have that? And
Yes.
I know it's on my shelf over here. I'm not going to go and get it, but
Yeah.
and I'm forgetting the author, but that's the title. And she, the woman who wrote it, works with traumatized women, I think exclusively. And she came to the recognition that different organs of the body prefer and gravitate towards certain narrative themes. So the liver has one set of themes that it seems to attract. The gallbladder, because I don't have one, I can speak of the present absence or the absent present of it. Each organ is narratively inflected, narratively attuned. And part of her therapy with women, and especially, and boy, it's been so many years since I read it, but you tripwired the title, and I know where it is on the shelf. This woman was suffering from breast cancer. So the woman who wrote the book began, I guess, what I would call a narrative therapy, where she began to read to and have this woman read back to her narratives that were, I don't want to say compatible, but in tune with her breast cancer, which then went into remission. So and Sheila, you tell me if I'm, I lost my guardrails and I'm off track here, but there's something, you know, if every story harbors a mythology that is shaping the narrative and maybe being shaped by it in a reciprocal relationship, which is what I sense, then the plot becomes the transport vehicle, I'm stealing Campbell's language there, for carrying that myth deep into the tissues of the body and can affect healing. So Sheila, respond to that to see if I got to it at all.
Yes, I still think though, and you mentioned in your talk many, many times, connective tissue. And the idea is that we do not need cognition. We get somatized with these patterns of metabolic forces that pull and push and twist and shear us, that we remember that cellularly.
Yes.
So it's not dependent on cognition. And
No.
I love the fact that you mentioned it was Nancy Mellon, I think her name is.
Nancy Mellon, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So thanks, Dennis, for considering that. I'm an analysan for many, many years, and I've made meaning out of my own life because of my embodied experiences of prenatal memory.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for that, Sheila.
We have
Do
Wendell.
we have time? We have time? Yeah, we're good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Dennis, it's Gwendolyn.
Oh, hi, Gwendolyn. I'm glad you're part of the group.
Yeah, I was able to get enough bandwidth to make it. A couple observations and a couple questions.
Yeah.
The first is that for the action of Hestia, I seem to remember, and I'd have to track down the specific references, but I also remember artistically, images of Hestia accepting and nurturing a divine child.
Oh, okay.
So that will definitely fit into what you have. The secondary concept, I had two questions, but I can merge them into one. As you said about the Greek culture, culturally, I see, and I hope you would recognize this as well, that Hestia as a Parthenos, which is an unmarried maiden, is very different from Vesta, a Virgo intacta. I think that allows Hestia to take more people in and to be more autonomous. And then also, so that's culturally a difference between the Roman and the Greek. And then you also,
very helpful.
If you look at the figure of Agni in Hindu, Agni as a male consumes and maybe, and on some level transmits the sacrifices, but he's mainly the fire as consumption, whereas Hestia is the fire of warming. And I kind of see that as the Greeks having a heavy survival of pre-Indo-European cultural contact versus what happened by the time the Indo-Europeans reached the Hindu state. So I just wanted to bring that forward to you in case that, you know, you could riff off it, or if you think it's helpful. That's all I wanted to do. So I wanted to thank you for this.
That's beautiful. No, that's new knowledge for me. Gwendolyn, you gave me a broader frame in which to understand her. Yeah, thank you for that.
Let's go with Mariam. Hang on, here we go. She'll be up in a sec.
Yeah.
Should be there. Mariam?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, good, Miriam.
Dennis, I miss you terribly. It's so nice to see you and
Thanks,
hear you here.
Thank you for that. I'm glad you're here, Miriam. Beautiful.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
About Hestia. But first, how great to just be considering Hestia right now with all of this time spent at home. It's really making me kind of wonder, how at home do I feel at home? And how, you know, how warm is my hearth? And I think it's probably a cultural condition right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is the question of home. But I would love to hear you speak about, you know, the fact that in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, it's very specifically kind of noted that the only three goddesses who aren't susceptible to her powers are Athena, Artemis, and Hestia.
Ah.
Right?
Beautiful. No, thank you for this. This is great.
So I would, you know, I'd love to hear you riff, if it's available to you, on the difference between the heartfeltness of a Hestia and an Aphroditic kind of heartfeltness.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to go back and read that. I'm just thinking. I'm just thinking about how they might be different. Let me toss it back and ask you, because you're closer to that hymn. What are your thoughts, or what struck or strikes you in that difference between Aphrodite and Hestia?
I've got to unmute her again.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Go ahead.
Please.
Well, all I can imagine right now is just because of my own work that I'm doing with Aphrodite in the dissertation, and just this kind of noticing that what that means is that really the only three beings, that the only mortal and divine that aren't susceptible to her, this Athena, Artemis, and Hestia, that means that they don't require intimate connection. Like, they don't actually feel any sort of that, like, loneliness and longing. And so, right? I mean, I think I'm.
So am I tracking you in understanding that Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite are, for lack of a better term, more distant goddesses? Or
Athena, Artemis, and Hestia. Yeah, they don't.
Yes, Hestia.
They don't connect on a very personal and intimate level.
Now that's interesting to me because it seems that Hestia is so heartfeltly connected to others and hospitable to others. So maybe I'm missing something, Miriam.
Well, I guess there's a difference between her connection and an Aphroditic, erotic, needy,
Yes.
Like it's a different level of intimacy, and maybe that's why she can connect with so many, is because she does have a sense of wholeness in herself that doesn't need to reveal to another or have a real whatever the Aphroditic connection is. I'm not going to say it's real and Hestia's is unreal. That's ridiculous. But I don't have an answer. Just not yet.
I agree.
I just know it's different.
I'm sensing that Hestia is more like the ground of being, and other activity-based or doing-based gods like Aphrodite, which are highly relational. Everything you see about Aphrodite is about that love and strife. And it's the attraction principle that drives Aphrodite, to Ares and Hephaestus and, these various gods that she has these relations with. But Hestia is always like Artemis, it's more of a condition, and it's certainly she doesn't pal around with anybody, and it's just not who she is constructed by the Greeks to be.
I wanted to mention, and hi, Miriam.
Yes.
Hi, Will.
I just wanted to mention that Plato's ultimate form is love, and the highest forms are not what we think of when we think of forms, because Aristotle totally ruined us into thinking that a form is of a horse. No, a form is beyond those specifics for Plato, and the ultimate form is something like love. And Plato bifurcated Aphrodite into the universal Aphrodite and the kind of embodied specific Aphrodite. And to me, it seems like, maybe Hestia is much more in line with that universal Aphrodite. It's more kind of like the love as the ground of being. To me, seems very shared between the universal Aphrodite and Hestia.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think she's a presence of those qualities that Barbara was developing and that I tried to add to. And so she's, in that respect, she's maybe, and this is what I was hearing Dana say too, she's more ontological than she is existential. I mean, if I could maybe try to use that as a way of speaking about her not only being grounded, but being ground itself. And then off of that come all these different forms of affection, toleration, patience, restraint, the ability to listen, the ability to converse. Yeah, Miriam, I hope that helps even a little bit.
There was a question from the audience as you close. If there's anything that you recommend they read, or anything anybody would benefit from reading before next 2 weeks from now.
Well, I would love to pick up on the Dante side of La Vita Nuova, which is available in a very inexpensive paperback. That's something that people could read, and I think they would enjoy reading the 41 sonnets that Dante lays out as his creative life starts to take shape. Yeah, and then I think I'll have ready the second essay that I wanted to suggest, and it's entitled Mimesis, Neurology, and the Aesthetics of Presence. So the mimetic mode, neurological insights, and the culmination of those in the aesthetic presencing of something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I'd like to hit. I mean, I'd like to do the Dante piece, and then we see what the clock is telling us, and then move into that, if that would work.
I think people can tell that we want to bring people into the audience in. We want to bring. We're just, you know, we just want to balance it the best we can and keep iterating and evolving. And if you guys have any feedback or thoughts, send it my way.
Yes. And selfishly, I'd love to have all of you return. And I know it's a burden on your time, but I just, selfishly, I'd love to have the 5 of you back and the participants.
You're loading us up with helium balloons.
Can we go around, and Kwame, can you just say something? I love your voice, you know that.
Just happy to be here, Dana. I appreciate the invite. I'll be back, man. I'm pretty sure I'm cool next the following 2 weeks. So I'm just
good.
Yeah, just happy to be here, brother. So thank you, man. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dara.
And Dara?
Yes, thank you. This is so wonderful. I mean, part of what happened to all of us when we left Pacifica, it was like, well, now what, you know? And this is, as someone said earlier, you know, you get to chat with your tribe, so it's always terrific. And I just wanted to, this is very, very short, but Dennis, regarding Hestia, had said in the beginning that she is the beginning and the end, and you know, made me think in the conversation you were just having about our inner feminine center, you know, of life before judgment. And there is something you've really left me with thinking about in terms of holding kind of inner hospitality, a space for myself to and I don't mean in a selfish way, I mean in an extended way, and as a participant of life. And it was very, very powerful. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara.
Yeah.
And how about you, John?
Just great thanks to you, Dennis, for such a rich talk full of so much material that I'll be thinking about for a long time. I'm really excited about watching for Hestia in the next 2 weeks and welcoming her because I believe she's going to appear in unexpected ways, and I'm going to really keep my eye out for her. I think she's being welcomed into our space just by our talking about her. So I'm excited to watch for her.
That's great, John. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank
It's
you
been
all.
a wonderful afternoon, and I'm deeply appreciative